My name is Paul Golin. I'm the executive director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and I am the staff lead on our initiative, Jews for a Secular Democracy. Welcome, and I'll ask my colleagues at Jews for a Secular Democracy to introduce themselves, but I want to lead off with our chair of this initiative, volunteer chair, Sheila Sebor, to begin and to tell us a bit about Jews for Secular Democracy, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. And I too want to welcome everybody to today's webinar, Jews and Church-State Separation. One of the questions that comes up when we start to have discussions is, why should we care about this topic? Don't we already have enough to worry about? And while that may be true in the current situation we find ourselves, we should care about this topic and the issues that it deals with, because more needs to be done to counter the current and the continuing threat to our understanding of the constitutional separation of church and state. And as a minority, Jews are probably more sensitive than many to the potential danger of this threat. Also, as Jews, tikkun olam, literally repair of the world, is one of our defining concepts. Most Jewish denominations consider it to be a human ability and responsibility to improve our world. The history of the Jews in the United States, which is what we are talking about, is a long one, and it begins almost at the very beginning of Western European settlement here. The foundational document, the uniquely foundational document of the American government, the Constitution, set down in no uncertain terms that there should be no establishment of a state religion and no religious test for its elected representatives. And it is because we have this document that we are able to use the tools it provides to defend its instructions. The phrase separation of church and state, which you won't find anywhere in the Constitution, was used by President Thomas Jefferson in 1802 when he wrote the opinion that the First Amendment's freedom of religion clause was designed to, quote, build a wall of separation between church and state, unquote. The fact that we have this document and the rules that it puts down has allowed us to practice our religion in relative peace and in safety, conditions that had not been met in many other parts of the world where Jews had previously wandered. This is a good news, bad news situation. The good news being that we've managed to successfully integrate into American society to a much greater extent than in other places and other times. The bad news is when there are setbacks, such as we've seen over the last several years and continuing today, is that it comes as something of a shock to many of us. Next slide, please. In response to this changed atmosphere, the Society for Humanistic Judaism launched Jews for a Secular Democracy, which is a pluralistic advocacy and education initiative that we hope will mobilize a wide diversity of Jews and their friends to defend Jefferson's noble phrase. We believe that we are uniquely positioned to talk about this, because although many Jewish organizations have church-state relations as one of their issues, it is not the only one, and it is often not the most important one. And while there are a number of organizations fighting to defend the separation of church and state, or religious beliefs from public policy, which is more specific, many are either interfaith or secular themselves. We believe that Jews in particular must lead on this issue, as we have been and still are the targets of regimes that were neither secular nor democracies. We have also been the beneficiary of governments that are both secular and democratic. Our great staff, Lincoln Dow, Sarah Levin, and Paul Golin, will be talking about the specifics of this initiative and the issues that exemplify our cause. Just to let you know, Paul and Lincoln are in New York, Sarah's in Philadelphia, and I am in Chicago. So this is not a one state, one region, one area initiative. We hope to bring it to all of you. And now I will turn it over to, I believe, Lincoln for a deeper dive into the issues that we all consider so important. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sheila. As you mentioned, I am Lincoln Dow. I am the community organizer of Jews for a Secular Democracy, and I've been a part of the initiative since September. I'm actually in Houston, Texas right now, but as she mentioned, I spend most of my time up in New York. And what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is go through a little bit of where the precedent for separation of religion and government comes from, in particular the establishment and free exercise clauses, and the judicial doctrine and jurisprudence that we've seen come out of the Supreme Court over the past many decades related to these two clauses. As Sheila mentioned, nowhere is the separation of church and state explicitly stated in our Constitution. But all of the work that we are focused on and all of these issues are related to these first 16 words of the Bill of Rights, the first two clauses of the First Amendment, which are on screen here. They are that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, like all parts of the Constitution, these couple of phrases have been interpreted over the years to mean different things by different courts, and of course, most importantly, by the Supreme Court. The first thing I should mention is that although Congress has stated this, like most of the Bill of Rights, has been incorporated into the states through the 14th Amendment. So the establishment of free exercise clauses apply throughout. No state can establish a religion. No state can endorse a religion. But once we get beyond that, things are a little bit less cut and dry. There have been very different interpretations of what exactly establishment of religion means and where exactly the line is between not establishing a religion while not abridging free exercise of religion, which is also protected in that second clause. One area where the court has been really unequivocal is staunch protection of our secular public schools. Since the mid-20th century, there has not been school prayer permitted, and that has been upheld time and time again by the Supreme Court. Creationism and creation science, which is just another term for creationism that does not conform with the scientific consensus on evolution, has not been permitted in our public schools, and no religious curriculum, even as electives, has been allowed by the courts either. However, once we get beyond public schools, we see a lot more equivocation from the court again. When it comes to public support for religious schools, for example, our taxpayer money going to private religious schools in the form of vouchers or in the form of in-kind aid, we've seen a lot of different decisions that don't lay clear one particular doctrine. Most recently, vouchers have been permitted in the state of Ohio, is where the first case was. And since then, voucher programs have continued to expand throughout the United States, and that's a complicated, nuanced issue. You know, a lot of Jewish schools might benefit from voucher programs, while at the same time, a lot of Jews don't want their taxpayer funding going to private sectarian schools, and that's quite reasonable. There's also been the question more recently of whether religious organizations, such as churches, can be excluded from generally applicable government aid programs. For example, some of y'all might remember just a few years back in the state of Missouri, there was a case called Trinity Lutheran Church, where a church had applied for funding from a state program to refurbish their playground, and the state of Missouri had explicitly excluded religious organizations. The Supreme Court found that Missouri could not do that. Religious organizations have to have access to the same programs that that non-religious organizations, non-religious entities do. And so here is where we see this interesting tension and this interesting balance between the establishment and the free exercise clauses, which, Paul, if you want to click to the next slide, it just highlights the free exercise clause. And one particular interesting test of the court's doctrine has been what I would describe as the court's willingness to secularize distinctly Christian symbology. Paul, next slide, please. One very clear example of this is this cross, which is a World War I memorial. And I think most people looking at it, especially us as Jews, would not describe that to be a secular symbol. It is very far from a secular symbol. It is very clearly a piece of Christian symbology. And yet, when this was brought before the court, it was upheld as constitutional, as not a violation of the Establishment Clause. This is on public land, upkept by the local government, by the way, in a 7-2 decision. I believe Sotomayor and Ginsburg were the dissenting justices. Because, like so many other pieces of American culture, the Supreme Court had decided that although this is initially a Christian symbol, it had adopted a sort of secular meaning. And if we go to the next slide, there is a particular quote from Supreme Court Justice Alito commenting on it. The cross is undoubtedly a Christian symbol, But that fact should not blind us to everything else that the cross has come to represent. And this is hardly limited to this one particular cross. This is a pattern that we've seen in Supreme Court jurisprudence over the years, starting decades and decades ago with Sunday closing laws, which were commonplace in certain states. Businesses had to close on Sundays, which is, of course, the Christian Sabbath. Yet when that was challenged as an endorsement and advancement of one particular religion, the court found otherwise, finding that having Sunday off had become an integral and secular tenet of American culture. The same is true with the under God phrase that has been inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance and in God we trust appearing on currency. These are things that the court has found unobjectionable because they've seemingly been secularized. And this might seem superficial, but it really is problematic for a number of reasons. And I would argue that the most substantial, harmful consequence of the secularization, supposedly, of these clearly non-secular Christian symbols is that it has allowed for the illusion that we are somehow a Christian nation to thrive. And it's that illusion and that myth that has generated so much harmful policy. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the Christian nationalist agenda that Jews for a Secular Democracy is committed to rejecting. One of those issues is the notion of family values. Whenever you hear family values in a political context, it is almost certainly coming from right-wing Christian nationalist organizations who are using that phrase to oppose LGBT equality, for example, to prevent same-sex couples from fostering children out of religiously affiliated orphanages. A lot of times you also hear it heard in tandem with the phrase Judeo-Christian values. You hear these same organizations claiming that we are a nation that is rooted in Judeo-Christian values, Judeo-Christian principles, ignoring the complete appropriation of us as Jews in that phrase. When you look at the opinion poll and you see that we as a group in the United States, as a political bloc in the United States, overwhelmingly support LGBTQ equality, we are overwhelmingly pro-choice, and we certainly don't support one religion's principles being applied as law in a way that would harm other people. And then lastly, we also see a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric, a lot of xenophobic rhetoric, which is just blatantly not what we stand for. In fact, Jews have unfortunately been discriminated against coming to the United States over the years. It happened to us as a phrase that we've started using and that you'll be seeing more from us on our social media, because too often we see that the rhetoric that is being used against the strangers, as they are called, or the aliens in the United States, is the exact same rhetoric that was applied to us. It's dehumanizing, and it's something that we cannot let stand. And in terms of more tangible policy, on the next slide, we also see that this narrative has translated to a lot of state-by-state legislation that is very harmful. Again, we see these license to discriminate policies, which are applicable in terms of LGBTQ families attempting to adopt from foster homes. We see businesses that are permitted to deny service to LGBTQ couples. We see cases like that is before the Supreme Court right now related to the Affordable Care Act's contraception mandate, where religious employers, famously in the Hobby Lobby case a few years ago, are granted exemptions to not have to provide birth control to their employees through company-provided insurance. And that's been expanded by the Trump administration. And we just published a blog post up on jfasd.org talking about the two recent cases that are before the Supreme Court right now that may strip away even further at the right to contraception through insurance by granting an even wider religious exemption. That's extremely dangerous. The last thing I want to talk about here is protecting secular education. We firmly believe that every American child has the right to secular education. And yet, when the Supreme Court is so willing to allow for voucher programs, and when so many state legislators have endorsed the idea of injecting public funds into religious schools, we see that right chipped away at. And that's something that we have to even confront within our own community. When we look at extremely religious schools and yeshivas, for example, in New York, that don't come anywhere near providing an adequate secular education to their students. It's not acceptable, and it's something that we have to address both within our community and outside it, and those are issues that Jews for a Secular Democracy is focused on. Unfortunately for us, we are seeing the exact opposite of our issues advocated for by those Christian nationalist organizations, and I'm going to turn it over to our program coordinator, Sarah Levin, to discuss their work and what they've been up to more in depth.
Thank you, Lincoln. One thing I want to point out from the previous slides that Lincoln went over is that there's both a cultural battle going on as well as a political battle, right? So when Lincoln was talking about why, this cross or in God we trust being on our currency, under God being in the pledge, it might seem superficial, it might seem unimportant, but the whole purpose, you can see the impact that making that so creating the illusion that this is just how it's always been, when we, by the way, know that in God we trust was added to the money and under God added to our pledge in the 1950s at the height of the Red Scare as part of a message against the godless communists. We end up with the kinds of court decisions we've seen because culturally there's this idea that, well, it's always been this way, and nobody really sees it as Christian, right? It's secularized, and so we need to fight back culturally to against that Christian nationalist message, as well as on a policy level where it's being weaponized. And so, if you have not heard of Project Blitz yet, I absolutely encourage you to look it up. We have the website right here, blitzwatch.org, that will tell you all about it. And I'll just give you a quick overview and a few examples of the kind of bills that we're seeing come out of this coordinated effort. So Project Blitz is a coordinated effort by Christian nationalists to inject religion into public education, attack reproductive health care, undermine LGBTQ equality, and with the ultimate goal of creating very broad religious exemptions to generally applicable laws, which Lincoln had mentioned. There are a group of Christian nationalist groups that are coordinating behind the scenes together. One big one is the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation, which was set up by a former Republican congressman, and it has a stated aim to, quote, protect religious freedom, preserve America's Judeo-Christian heritage, and promote prayer. So you can see why we took some time to dissect the phrase Judeo-Christian and why it's so problematic, because you can see how it's being used. Jews for a Secular Democracy is a proud member of the Blitzwatch Coalition, which is a campaign and also a coordinated effort among several national organizations to monitor, track, and defeat attempts by Christian nationalists to implement this very distorted view of religious freedom at the state level. So basically, what Project Blitz does is it shops around model legislation to state legislators across the country. And their playbook was actually, is public knowledge. You can go and find it. They tried to be secretive. In fact, on a relatively recent conference call that some secularists were able to sneak onto, because there's been so much media attention thanks to Blitzwatch on the project, they're trying to rename it so that they can continue to do what they're doing under the radar. And so shining a light on Project Blitz really does work. So to give you a sense of their success, in 2018, over 70 Project Blitz related bills were introduced in state legislatures across the country. And the way that they go about it, and I'll go into this in the next slide in just a moment here, is starting with bills that appear harmless, that are hard for both Republicans and Democrats to take any issue with, because the idea is to slowly chip away, starting with those sort of symbolic, seemingly harmless or superficial bills that have symbolic value and play on this kind of decades-long effort to create a myth that we are a Christian nation, and all of these symbols we see on our currency, on our pledge, the national motto, the cross example that Lincoln showed earlier. It's to kind of numb us to the idea that these are actually, they are overtly Christian and religious symbols, and there is an underlying agenda behind them, and they really have done a great job of getting folks to just not really even notice what is going on here. And so on the next slide, I want to talk about In God We Trust bills, because it's a very intentional that this is kind of the first round of bills that they've gotten introduced at the state level. So if you weren't aware, the national motto was changed in 1956 from E Pluribus Unum, which means out of many, one, to In God We Trust, and as I mentioned before, playing on fears of godless communists. A lot of folks to this day have no idea that In God We Trust hasn't always been the motto, and that's what they want. They want people to think that since our founding, In God We Trust has been our national motto. And so there's a variety of different bills that have been introduced that kind of reinforce the motto in different ways. In some cases, they are mandating, these bills are mandating that In God We Trust be prominently displayed in all public schools. In other cases, they are creating programs in which citizens can purchase license plates that say "In God We Trust," and in a number of cases, the funding that the state is that's being collected from those license plates are going to nefarious Christian nationalist groups. So, for example, a failed 2017 Michigan bill would have created license plates that include the phrase "Choose Life," with proceeds from the sales of those plates going to religious anti-abortion organizers, including so-called crisis pregnancy centers. Another example specific to In God We Trust, there was a foundation set up called the In God We Trust Foundation that sponsored In God We Trust license plates. And it was found that they used the funds not for the children of fallen first responders, as they promised, but for, quote, purposes not authorized in Florida statutes. There was an investigation and an audit that followed, but there were already hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of dollars that were spent nefariously or inappropriately rather than what they were intentionally used for. Another example is in Arizona, license plate funding was going to the Alliance Defending Freedom, and these were for In God We Trust license plates. And Alliance Defending Freedom is an anti-LGBTQ Christian nationalist group. You may have also recognized their name because they represented the baker in the Colorado case in Masterpiece Cake Shop, which unfortunately set a new precedent that allows businesses to discriminate on the basis of religion. And so, again, I want to reiterate that the whole point of Project Blitz, starting with In God We Trust bills as their sort of stage one, is to eventually build up to a stage where they've built momentum, they've gotten these kinds of bills passed, and then they start advocating for broader religious exemptions, for example, and not just religious exemptions from generally applicable laws, but taxpayer funding with the privilege of taxpayer funding in addition to discriminating. So, for example, we are seeing a lot of bills being introduced that would allow adoption and foster care agencies that are receiving taxpayer dollars, grants from the state, to then turn around and not accept parents, otherwise qualified parents or foster care families for any reason based on religion, whether because they're a same-sex couple, a Jewish couple, an interfaith couple, or just a couple that doesn't necessarily fit their very specific set of beliefs. So not only do they want to be able to get out of non-discrimination laws, to get out of public health and safety laws using religion as sort of a, get out of it, jail-free card, but also to be able to receive taxpayer funding. And an interesting way that they're going about it in terms of messaging is, while they're trying to get out of non-discrimination laws, in these bills, the language of the bills is characterizing the government as discriminating if the government is saying, we're not going to give you funding because you discriminate. So they're flipping discrimination and calling it discrimination when the government is saying, we're not going to give taxpayer dollars to these kinds of organizations. And it all starts with bills like this. And I also want to point out that it is very easy to say, well, a lot of these bills didn't get passed. But the reason we're here today, and especially with the court cases that Lincoln talked about before, that was decades of work that the Christian nationalists did to make things like a 40-foot cross seem or be interpreted as a secularized symbol. And so they really do thrive, these groups, and they do very well when they are under the radar and when they are underestimated. And so we can't make the mistake of seeing, a large percentage of these bills not passing, and a lot of them are, by the way, and thinking that, well, they're not going to get very far, because lobbying is a long game, and they have made great gains for the last 2 decades, and they're going to continue to make gains if we don't stand up from stage one. And we can't wait until they get these kinds of bills, like these license plate and In God We Trust bills, passed, and then we'll be way behind the ball when they get to the broader exemption bills. So on the next slide, I want to give you another example of the kind of bills to watch out for. So this is a bill that was introduced in Ohio, the Student Religious Liberties Act. And so the issue that Lincoln was talking about earlier with secular education, this really plays into that, because bills like this are trying to find sneaky ways to insert religion into the classroom. So what I want to point out about this bill, this is language directly from the bill: no school district shall prohibit a student from engaging in religious expression in the completion of homework, artwork, or other written oral assignments. So you can imagine one of the problems with this kind of language is that even though it's couched in terms of religious expression by the student, think about if you have a homework assignment from your science teacher and there might be questions about it or exercises that relate to evolution. With a bill like this, a student who just doesn't believe in evolution, who believes the world is 6,000 years old, could answer those questions or do the exercises incorrectly and then claim that they have a right to be expressing their religion, and then the teacher could be penalized for giving the student a failing grade for not correctly answering those questions. And so that's something to look out for. We're also seeing similar bills, academic freedom bills, and attempts to make it easier for students and teachers to proselytize. And I want to make very clear that as of now, students have always had the right to pray in school as long as it didn't interrupt the school day. But there's a lot of bills out there that create a problem that isn't there, as if students religious freedoms are being curtailed. And the purpose of them is, one, to stoke fear, but also to find ways to make it easier for students and teachers to use opportunities to proselytize. And they want to blur the lines. So these are bills to be looking out for as well. The next slide is also relevant to education. So there are currently 7 states that mandate Bible courses to be available in public schools: Arizona, Arkansas, Georgia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Texas. And again, I know a lot of those states are maybe kind of usual suspects, but I wouldn't write off bills getting introduced in other states, because again, this movement has done a very good job of chipping away over time. And so we have to be very vigilant. And so here's an example that might surprise you. There was a Bible classes bill that was introduced in New York. And the bills can vary, and a lot of times they just skate up to the line of what might be permissible. Of course, as long as it is an elective and it isn't mandated and it is taught in a way that is objective and it isn't teaching the Bible as fact, that is permissible. But you can imagine, first of all, in terms of implementation, that isn't necessarily happening, even though there may not technically be allowed to teach the Bible in this way. When there is an elective, they do. And also, you keep in mind, what is the point of this? Even if they are completely within the letter of the law, what is really the purpose of making these electives available? It's to do similarly what they're doing within God We Trust bills, which is to normalize Christianity, specifically Christianity, to be a part of our everyday lives, to the point where it's seen as just, well, that's the way it's always been, and well, isn't this sort of just a secularized thing at this point? And of course, that's not the case. You can imagine what the response would be if there were bills that mandated that there be electives, classes on learning the Quran, perhaps, or the Torah. And so this is something to be aware of as well. Next slide, we talked about this a little bit, but I want to elaborate on the adoption and foster care. There is a variety of different bills. Some of them are very, very specific to LGBTQ parents and allowing adoption and foster care agencies to discriminate on the basis of religion. But a lot of times they can be much broader, and I want to draw attention to how this has impacted Jews in particular. So Miracle Hill Ministries in South Carolina has received a waiver from the Trump administration, and there's the case here where they actually turned away qualified Jewish folks and Catholic folks as well. And so it's really important when we talk about these issues, although there are bills that are specific to discrimination based on same-sex sexual orientation and gender identity, a lot of these bills are written so broadly that an agency could discriminate on the basis of religion against anyone, including Jews, including Catholics, even Protestants, perhaps, that don't narrowly fit the type of evangelical or specific denomination or beliefs that the agency and their owners or whoever runs it believes in. And so when we talk about it, we need to demonstrate how this impacts Jewish people and how it can be used to discriminate against anyone for any reason, particularly highlighting when these bills allow discrimination using taxpayer funds. And on the next slide, I have a list of states that currently allow discrimination by child welfare agencies. And you might be not unsurprised by the list. I think the reason I wanted to show this is because to point to the year, to show that this is actually relatively recent. These laws haven't been on the books for that long. You'll see a lot of 2018, 2017. 5 additional states have considered similar legislation recently, including Colorado and Massachusetts. And so Christian nationalists are not just limiting their strategy to deeply conservative states, and we should take them seriously, as I mentioned before, because they have a track record of success in chipping away at our secular democracy under the radar in very unlikely places. And with that, I want to just reiterate that we have resources. Blitzwatch.org is a great resource. You can take a look at where things are happening. Even if you are in a state where you feel that these bills are not likely to pass, and you might be right, it is so important because of what we talked about earlier about the appropriation of Jews in the phrase Judeo-Christian values, the long-term strategy they have here of just acclimating people to seeing these sorts of things. Even if you're in a state like Colorado or Massachusetts, where these bills are never going to, anytime soon, even get a vote, it is important to stand up and be loud about it and bring attention to it. Because first of all, as soon as you shine a light on what they're doing, they have to retreat, rename their initiatives, and we have to put them on the defensive. Because if we don't put them on the defensive and illustrate to folks what this initiative is, what the larger goal is, and how it undermines religious freedom, then they are going to be able to continue to chip away, and we might find ourselves surprised in a few years at how much success they're having. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Great, thanks so much. Hi, everybody. So the question for us is not just what's happening with separation of church and state, but really how do we address it in a way that brings our Jewish identity, historical experience, religiosity or religiosities within Judaism, because we're a small group of people with a wide variety of understanding of our own religion, which in this case, I think actually adds to our ability to demonstrate that the government should be neutral toward religion. So I want to step back and kind of ask that question of ourselves and of you. What do we bring to this as Jews? And certainly one of the pieces is the historical experience. And so I have I pulled a quote here from a letter that George Washington wrote to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, a month after he actually visited and met with them. And it's really remarkable, and it's preserved at the Torah synagogue up there, because here is the first president of the United States basically guaranteeing the right to Jews to be Jewish in this country. The red part of this quote says that the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. In other words, obey the laws, and you can worship however you want. And in 1790, this is radical. This is a dramatic departure from everything the Jews had experienced ever, or at least certainly since the fall of the Second Temple. And it was really a remarkable ideology. And of course, the ideal versus how it is then enacted is often not aligned, and historically hasn't been aligned. We know that there were many points in US history when Jews were discriminated in the same way that other minorities, other religious minorities have experienced discrimination as well. The one I'm highlighting here is the Immigration Act of 1924. This is after a huge wave of Jews had come over from Eastern Europe and Russia beginning in the 1880s. Many of us have relatives who were in those waves of immigration. But of course, what this led to was so many of our relatives being murdered in Europe, unable to escape what was happening there because of the tremendous restrictions on immigration here in the US, simply because they were Jewish. And this is both, in some ways it was more an ethnic discrimination than religious, but we see this even today with the Muslim ban. And how do you pull out what's being discriminated? Clearly, if they say no Muslims, that's about religion, but we also know that this is about ethnicity and national origin as well. There were anti-Catholic quotas as well. We know that through the 30s and 40s, there were limits on Jews being able to attend colleges. The Ivy Leagues had quotas on Jews. Jews were restricted by which neighborhoods they can live in. There were hotels. I mean, the reason there was the Catskills is because Jews couldn't go to whatever resort hotels they wanted. They couldn't join whatever country clubs they wanted. And some of the folks on this call, this is living memory, or it's certainly within our parents' and grandparents' lifetimes. So using Jewish history is one of the ways that we can stand up as Jews and again say, we've been through this as a people and we don't want this to happen to anybody else. And that's why we want to utilize what's there in our Constitution to help other people. And when we have been thinking about this as we began this initiative, Jews for a Secular Democracy, we're constantly thinking about how do we make sure that we're staying on point and bringing this unique Jewish angle to every piece of advocacy that we do, because there are great organizations working to protect separation of church and state from either cross-religious perspective or secular perspective. And there are great Jewish organizations that attack the individual issues like LGBTQ equality. And they at times reference the First Amendment rights. But we felt that there was a unique message for us to put out there that specifically said, as Jews, we feel this way about this issue because we are deserving of the same protections that are guaranteed to all religions. That when the government persecutes somebody based on a belief or religious belief, even if it's not Jews, Jews need to stand up and say, we've been there and we can't accommodate that. And again, while there's a wide diversity of Jewish religious beliefs, while still being within this umbrella of people who call themselves Jews, there is an ethic that comes not just from our historic experience, but from our religious experience. There is no mitzvah. A mitzvah is a commandment. And whether or not you believe that those commandments come from a divine source or it's just a combination of human wisdom, no mitzvah is repeated in the Torah more often than you shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And there are just so many times a day, if you follow with the news, where you can ask yourself, how can I apply this mitzvah? And is this right? Are we doing right by people who are not in our group? And so I know that much of Jewish social justice and action is based on this idea of loving the stranger, for we were strangers in the land of Egypt. And that land of Egypt, of course, can be extended metaphorically to all the times and all the places when Jews were persecuted. And what an incredible achievement and opportunity the US Constitution is to provide for freedom and equality. And despite the limitations that were placed on Jews through the 20th century, at least up to the mid or late mid 20th century, Jews were able to not just survive, but thrive in the United States. And so much of it is directly related to this idea of freedom of religious practice. And if in the early days it was more about tolerance than actual equality, there was the ideal. And that ideal remains with us. And that ideal is really what we're trying to work toward. So as touched upon already, just to kind of recap, we see so many of the issues that are happening today relating to this clause, really, not even the whole First Amendment. It's just the establishment clause within the First Amendment that suggests that immigration laws should be fair and, we're not advocating for open borders or no immigration laws. We recognize the challenges of operating a country, but when you're saying people can't come because of their religion, that's a fundamental breach of what our country is supposed to stand for. Likewise, reproductive rights and women's rights. What is the role of women in society? And clearly, that has evolved over the history of America and the world, and needs to continue to evolve because we're not there yet. On reproductive rights, which feels like it was a battle that was won with Roe v. Wade, clearly it wasn't. And even in Roe v. Wade, the question was, is the government favoring one religion over other religions by saying life begins at conception? Judaism has never seen life beginning at conception. Judaism has always valued the life of the mother over the life of the fetus. These are things that are fairly clear-cut in Jewish religious law. And if the US laws are being based on another religion's idea of when does life begin, then it's discrimination against religions like Judaism, and we're not the only ones who don't believe that life begins the moment sperm enters egg. So certainly we see abortion rights as relating to separation of church and state. And again, there are incredible Jewish organizations who are working on it. They touch on separation of church and state at times. We feel like this is an issue that we can raise up because to us, upholding that First Amendment is patriotic. It is American, right? And so often on these issues, it's one side that is co-opting the notion of who is representing real America, who is representing patriotism. And there can't be anything more American than the First Amendment. And so as Jews, I feel like these are topics that we should continue to advocate for from their specific approach, but that can also be combined to recognize that that there's a protection here that was built into America from the very foundation that we need to acknowledge and celebrate and protect. LGBTQ rights is another one that obviously was not built into the foundation of American society 200 and some odd years ago, but ideas evolve. And in Judaism, acceptance of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer is continuing to evolve. 40 years ago, we were in a very different place as a religious community, as a religious minority here in America on gay and lesbian rights. And our religion continues to evolve on this, but you now have all of the liberal Jewish denominations and aspects of the Orthodox community that support gay marriage, legal gay marriage, and have approaches to LGBTQ equality that differ very much from the evangelical Christian approach, which, by the way, is not even necessarily the majority Christian approach in this country today. So that was an issue. We've talked about secular education. There was a question in the Q&A, I believe, touching on Jewish religious education. Here, I'm in New York City, and this has been a big issue, and there's an excellent organization called YAFED, which we had a webinar about a month and a half ago, where the exec of YAFED, who is fighting for secular education in yeshivas, Jewish schools, Jewish private schools. So it's not just evangelical Christians, but it is, they're the ones who are pushing this agenda because they've got the political power right now to get their way. So we're in alliance with YAFED, but I think our larger issue is around secular education. And you know, when we talk about history, I think that we should also be mindful of today's current situation, which I believe this is the longest conversation I've been involved in 2 months, where no one has said coronavirus yet, but you know, there I just said it. And so that's why we're doing these webinars. But frankly, you know, it's the one silver lining perhaps is that we're able to still bring people together and actually bring a good group of people together to have these conversations. The downside is the technology, and we understand a couple of you may be having some technical issues, and we apologize for that. But even today, these issues of separation of church and state are affecting us and our country's response to a pandemic in ways that, if you look at Europe, which ironically, so Europe, many countries in Europe don't have this kind of First Amendment separation of church and state built into their government structures. And yet, because Europe has secularized so much since the end of World War II, I believe that they're being guided much more by what science is saying, what their medical profession is saying. And today we're seeing battles about when can churches reopen. We're seeing churches opening against the guidelines, and we're seeing people get sick and die because they're ignoring the science. And what is the government's role in, quite frankly, enforcing science onto people and overriding their religious rights to bring 1,000 people together in the same building right now, right? You know, and this is a debate, and this is why we have court systems, and this is why we have advocates, and this is why we can have these kind of conversations of what's right and what's wrong. What are people free to do? What does freedom even mean? Versus what is the role of government and the responsibility of government in a time of pandemic. And, you know, so the last item on here is climate crisis, but in a lot of ways, this pandemic ties into that climate crisis about what do people believe about science? How is that being eroded, and who's behind it? And how does it tie into this religious fundamentalist agenda that has, by almost all measurements, been wildly successful? They've laid the groundwork for decades, and they're reaping the rewards now in tremendous ways, including who sits on the Supreme Court now, and how dramatically they're changing an understanding of separation of church and state, and where that may end up, because as you know, the makeup of the Supreme Court doesn't change every 4 or 8 years as the makeup of the White House does. So these are all issues that we're thinking about, and that we're looking for folks in local communities to work with us on, to share this mission with us, and to mobilize people on the ground around these issues, saying, as Jews or as family members of Jews, friends of Jews, allies of Jews, you know, we stand for this because of our experiences, because of our beliefs, because our government is required to consider our viewpoints as well as the viewpoints of the dominant religious strain right now that our lawmakers are listening to the most. So at our website, jewsdemocracy.org or jfasd.org, both will take you to the same site. If you haven't already, you know, please sign up for our mailing list. And we are going to, we're in the process of completing a training program for folks who want to be leaders on the ground around these issues. And, you know, as Sarah and Lincoln have discussed, what's happening in different states is being coordinated, but is a little bit different state by state. So we will obviously have to tailor responses state by state. And as I mentioned, here in New York, it's actually, not just Christian fundamentalism, but also Jewish fundamentalism in some ways, religious fundamentalism more broadly. But in almost all of our states, there are things that are happening among those issues that were just listed where we can step up and we can say, as Jews and as Americans protected by the First Amendment, here's how what's happening isn't right. And of course, we're a nonprofit, so we're obligated to include that donate mentioned there. So I want to open it up to Q&A. And I just want to acknowledge that we did get a couple of questions that were sent in before the webinar began. One was from Dell, who asked, how do we separate the church from the courts? And I think you're kind of implying what I was just talking about in terms of the Supreme Court or the lower courts, where religious fundamentalism may have advocates who are in power to push through laws that violate our understanding of the First Amendment. I think the answer is we can't necessarily get them off the court, but we can work with legislators to change the laws, right? The Supreme Court doesn't make the laws. The legislators do. And that's where we have to apply our pressure, I believe. And Sheila and Lincoln and Sarah, feel free to jump in on any of these. The other question was from David, who did also ask about, the Jewish fundamentalism, and said, what are you doing to ensure separation of religion and state within your own party? So I just want to say that you don't know my party affiliation. You might be able to guess it, but this isn't it's not a partisan initiative. And so I mentioned the challenge of the yeshivas here in New York, and it's not all yeshivot. It is about, according to YAFED, it's YAFFED, by the way, if you want to find them online. They think it's about 24, like 20 to 24 yeshivas. And the founder of YAFED, who gave us a very interesting webinar, he graduated yeshiva, high school, barely understanding English, barely able to communicate, not having been taught in the secular subjects, more than just rudimentary math and English, because the focus is all on religious education and Talmud study, and particularly for the boys. It's less bad for the girls because they're not expected to become Talmud scholars. So absolutely, this is not necessarily a Democrat-Republican thing. And in fact, in looking at how legislators vote in New York State, which is something we did for our members who are here in New York, there were many Democrats who voted in ways that we would have asked them not to on the we identified 5 bills that were directly related to separation of church and state. So that's not a Democrat-Republican thing, although there are, more on one side than the other, but it is important for us to make sure that we continue to be both pluralist, Jewishly pluralistic, but also nonpartisan. And Lincoln and Sarah, if you want to jump in on any of I'll look at the Q&A now. And again, as a reminder, there's a box that you can open on your screen, the Q&A box, and you can write your questions to us, and we'll try our best to answer them over the next couple of minutes that we have together.
Well, I was just typing an answer to David Fleischman's question, so I figured I might just address it. So one of his questions, he says, we keep talking about the threat from Christian fundamentalism and claiming that the majority of Americans are not Christian fundamentalists, but to what extent are we underestimating support for fundamentalist policies thanks to agreement among Christian, Muslim, and Orthodox Jewish fundamentalists? I I want to answer that question because I want to make clear, I think it's an important point to note that they are not the majority. We have polling to show that where Americans stand on these issues, and when they're polled, and there's, it depends on the way the question is asked, but I was just looking recently at polling done by Americans United for separation of church and state, and majorities of people support the notion of separation of religion and government. What they also found in that same survey is that while most Americans agree on that principle, the level of urgency is very low. Most of the people polled didn't see the threat level as very serious. And so that's a really important point. It's not that we have majorities of people or even a plurality of people who agree with these views. The problem is that, like I mentioned before, Christian nationalists are going under the radar and under people's noses. Folks are not aware of the degree to which they've had success. And so without a level of urgency, that leads to sort of unintentional apathy, because if you don't know the problem is there, you're not going to organize to fight back. The other thing I would say is that there are a lot of issues where the majority of Americans their stand on an issue is one way, but the policy is the opposite, or just doesn't reflect that majority opinion. The idea that having a majority necessarily reflects policy, it just doesn't bear out that way. Too often, interest groups that are just very well organized and well funded, that are united on their common agenda, which Christian nationalists are and have been for decades, can determine policy, even if the majority of Americans are not in agreement. And so I think that those are the 2 points I wanted to make about that question. And then similarly, on that kind of majority question, David asked a second question about, what do we say to people who argue that democracy can mean changing the laws if more Americans' views are evolving in favor of religion-inspired public policies? So, as demographics change, he said, due to fundamentalist higher birth rates and retention rates, why should America be preserved as a religiously neutral government? And I want to say, I think the founders had a lot to say about that, because they were very cognizant that there's such thing as a tyranny of the majority. And that's why we have these rights enshrined in our Constitution, fully aware that things like that can happen, that a tyrannical majority can impose its views on a minority. And so I think that's the talking point, is go back to the founding principles, go back to the writings of the founders who wanted to ensure that we weren't ruled by a mobocracy.
And I think that's a great point. And the other point is that we also know demographically that they're not a growing percentage. They're actually shrinking. The a percent of Americans who are evangelical Christians has declined. And a lot of the reason why is because of the intertwining of politics compared to where they were 40 or 50 years ago, when they literally would not talk about politics at all because it was supposed to be focused all on religion. And yet it doesn't matter, because as long as they have the political strings to pull, they know now is the time for them to get as much as they can of their agenda done. And in fact, the fastest growing group of Americans are those who are not affiliated with any religion at all. And it's something that we really haven't touched on yet in this call, but the nuns, as the Pew Foundation calls them, no religious affiliation, that's a group that, when we talk about separation of church and state, it's not just about favoring one religion over other religions, it's about favoring religion at all over no religion. And those are two different things that we want to look out for and protect, particularly because so many Jews are secular. So many Jews are not religious in the traditional Jewish religious sense of things, yet still strongly identify Jewishly. So that's something that we want to discuss, that we want to make sure we highlight as an initiative as well. And I want to address, because two different people asked about Americans United for separation of church and state. What's our relationship? Are we just reinventing the wheel, which we absolutely hope that we're not doing and don't want to do. A year ago, back when people could gather in the same place, which now somehow feels like 5 years ago, the parent organization or sponsoring organization of this initiative, which I'm the executive director of, Society for Humanistic Judaism had our 50th anniversary conference out in Michigan, and our keynote speaker was Rachel Lazar, who is the CEO of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and we gave her our first or inaugural Jews for a Secular Democracy Constitutional Defender Award, and she came out and she accepted it, and she was literally the first person I called when we launched this initiative, because I wanted to make it absolutely clear that we're not replicating, and if anything, we want to raise up their work in the Jewish community. I've been a Jewish communal professional for 20 years, my God, and I have been at SHJ for the past 4, and until I got to SHJ, I was unaware of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and I don't think I am particularly unaware of news and nonprofit organizations. I think that there are lots of Jews that we can reach who are unaware of the effort by Americans United or Freedom from Religion Foundation that are more involved in the Jewish communal ecosystem than in that ecosystem. They may know ACLU, they obviously, these are, and someone pointed out, these are large, well-funded, great organizations. But what Rachel pointed out to us and to me, and why she seemed not to be upset, and in fact was supportive and came out and accepted our award and gave an amazing presentation that we have up on YouTube, is that we can come at it as Jews. We're leading with it. It's the first word in our name. And Americans United is on purpose uniting and bringing everyone together. And so we can actually say things as an organization that Americans United can't. So when it's things that they can do, and by the way, they have lawyers on staff who bring cases in front of the government, and they do just amazing work that we're nowhere near doing that yet, if we ever do. But I think we do provide this unique spin on it that they can't. Now, of course, Rachel can and does, because she's also Jewish. She's the first woman leader of Americans United and the first Jewish leader of Americans United. And it's great. And she recently had a piece which, in the Jewish Forward newspaper, where she was able to say, as a Jew, X, Y, and Z. But their organization can't do it. Their organization is not going to drill down on the depth of Jewish ethics and religion and history and culture and bring that with us into this conversation. Sheila, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, to be more specific on that point, Paul, I had a conversation with Rachel Lazar at that meeting and brought up the subject of going after the Judeo-Christian values issue. And she said, I love it. We can't do it, but I love it. So regardless of her personal feelings as an organization, there are things that they can't really take on because of the structure and the nature of their organization, but they would be very happy if we would do that.
And we're working, we have reached out to many organizations. Someone asked about local Jewish community relations councils. So again, one of the early things we did when we launched this initiative was have Society for Humanistic Judaism join the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable, which has representatives of many of these organizations come around the table. And I reached out to many of them individually to let them know what we're doing and to help them understand that we're bringing a perspective. There is the issues overlap, but the angle, I think, is unique. And so it's not going to work for everybody. And if you support AU and you think you got it covered through them, absolutely, go for it. Just to bring my other hat as exec of Society for Humanistic Judaism, there's a great organization, American Humanist Association, and they're also very much involved in the separation of church and state protection from a completely secular perspective. But I've heard from a couple of people who are deeply involved in American Humanist Association, well, why do you need Jewish humanists? Why can't you guys all just be humanists, right? And so in some ways, it's kind of like that with separation of church and state. Why can't you all just be part of Americans United for Separation of Church and State? And by the way, I am a member, but it's not mutually exclusive. I can do both, and I am doing both. And I think we're able to bring just a different voice and a unique experience.
And to that point as well, we also have a foot in the secular group of organizations, because our parent organization is also a member of the Secular Coalition for America.
Right, right. So yes, bend the arc.
Paul, do we have, I know we're, sorry, I know we're over time. I was going to throw in a question. Were you going to take a question?
Well, I'm just going to quickly someone also asked about Bend the Arc, which it's an organization I deeply admire, and we absolutely were in touch with them as well. National Council of Jewish Women, the RAC, the Religious Action Center, historically has done some work on separation of church and state. This is the Reform movement. You know, Reform is the largest Jewish denomination in the country, and this is their social action arm, Religious Action Center. And they come at things from the Jewish religious perspective. So they will say things like, because we were all created in the image of God, therefore gays and lesbians are equal, you know, blah, blah, blah. As an organization or initiative that wants to represent Jews more broadly, more pluralistically, and recognizing that many of us are secular, we are not going to lead with because we were all created in the image of God. You know, we might say, you know, our religious approach is this, and our secular and cultural approach is this, and our historic approach is this, and bring all of it to the table. That's our goal. So, you know, I reached out to the RAC and many of these other amazing organizations that are doing great work. You know, there's a great LGBTQ Jewish organization called Keshet. I've seen them mention the First Amendment a couple of times, but it's not like the banner that they're flying. They're more about including LGBTQ within the Jewish community. And I love the work that they do. I, again, feel like we've got this unique angle and we have to share it. You want to just answer one more, Sarah, and then we'll be mindful of everybody's time.
Yes, and please, if you have more questions that you weren't able to ask, please feel free to email them. We can actually maybe go back to the thank you slide and have our contact information there. So I wanted to combine two questions that I have a similar answer to. Larry Marks asked about long-term trends. He said, regardless of who wins the next national election, are there general trends that would lead to an increase or a decrease in the role of religion in American government, consider 1 or 2 generations out? And our anonymous attendee also asked, he said, this discussion is focused primarily on legislative assaults. The U.S. Senate at this very moment is rushing to stack the court with Christian zealots. Does Jews for a Secular Democracy monitor state and federal bench nominations? And to what degree can we fight judicial assault? So I'm going to sort of combine those with my answer. Long-term trends, I think one thing we have to be aware of, and it's a little bit, I don't mean to be negative, it's just the reality is that the Christian nationalists started building their movement 40 years ago and they are reaping the benefits now. And unfortunately, we're extremely behind now in terms of the courts, because they have stacked the courts and will continue to stack the courts. And so we've essentially lost that battle for generations to come in some ways. However, the good news is if we are successful at organizing our and taking advantage of the demographic advantages, again, that it is not guaranteed that things will change just as the country and the population becomes more secular. But if we leverage that increasing amount of secular and non-religious people and our allies, we will be able to beat it back. And I want to point out that while Jews for Secular Democracy is not focused right now on judicial nominations, there are organizations that are. Alliance for Justice does a lot of tracking of judicial appointments. The Freedom from Religion Foundation has been doing a lot to look at nominees. And on the legal front as well, in terms of, it's not just about beating back the bad nominees now, it's about how do we do what the Christian right did, which is build a bench, build a pipeline, so that they have, once they have power, they have a ready list and network of judges that agree with their perspective. And so the things that we can do and things that are being done, first of all, the American Humanist Association started a program that is meant to essentially replicate what the Federalist Society did, which is the basically bank of and pipeline of conservative judges, and are starting to network humanist legal experts so that we can build our own pipeline. And so I think there are things we can do in the movement. If you know people who are in the legal profession, who are humanists or who are allied on these issues, plugging them into the movement, them into the American Humanist Association. I know the Secular Student Alliance has an alumni program, and they have chapters that are based in law schools. And so if we can do a better job of connecting humanists and people who agree with our perspective on church-state separation, who are already in the legal profession, with the secular movement, then we can start building that bench for ourselves. In parallel, we need to build the political power so that we can be the ones to hand over that list of nominees. And so the question about general trends, I think one of the things that the Christian right did very early on that we need to also start doing is focusing on the down ballot races, because you're right, the national election is not the end all be all. A lot of what happens, and the reason we focused on Project Blitz, is because state legislatures frankly get a lot more done than Congress does. They pass a lot more bills and the closer you get with government, state than local, the more impact directly they have on your lives. And so the Christian right has done a really good job of engaging at the local level. They started running candidates years and years ago. And so getting involved in things like school board elections, I know Sheila can talk about this because she is elected to her local township, working on building relationships and paying attention to what's going on at the local level and the state level is how we build power and catch things like the nasty things happening at the school board level, where they're changing what students are seeing in their textbooks. So the long-term trends in general are they are going to continue, even though they've gotten to the highest levels of power at the White House. They're continuing, and we need to start doing this as well to chip away at the state and the local level.
Great, thank you. And I just want to thank everybody for participating. We find this very valuable as far as input for what are the issues that you care about. As you can see, there are so many that can tie into separation of church and state, and we have some specifics that we're going to work on, and we will keep you updated as we move forward on them. But it's really helpful to hear the things that you're thinking about as well. And we would love for folks to get involved in this work and to help guide us on this. And you will hopefully hear a lot more from us if you're on our email list. If you did find us through a promotion on Facebook, please, jewsdemocracy.org, sign up. We don't send a ton of email. We won't fill your inbox with it, but every so often we'll send you one, and we would love for your involvement in this work because we believe it's so essential and it's about our future. So thank you all so much for being a part of this, and much more to come. Take care.